Thank you very much. Now, last year's guest was Guido Calabresi, former dean of the Yale Law School and senior judge of the U.S. Court of Appeal for the Second Circuit in New York. This year's guest comes from Yale Law School as well, and actually I understand he was one of Guido Calabresi's students when they were both just a little younger.
Un poco.
Robert A. Burt, our guest, is Alexander M. Bickel Professor of Law, teaching courses on medicine, ethics and law, regulating law, sex and marriage, family law, and the Book of Job and Injustice. È un corso che si chiama Il libro di Giobbe e l'ingiustizia, taught at the Yale Law School. And this course was the subject of his latest publication, the book entitled In the Worldwide, God and Humanity in Conflict, published in 2012 by Harvard University Press. And Bob Burt's career has been absolutely prestigious, and it includes several remarkable achievements and experiences. First of all, he was graduated at Princeton, at Yale, where he was a Yale Law Journal note and comment editor, and at Oxford, where he spent 2 years as a Fulbright scholar. After graduation, he served as a law clerk to Chief Judge David Bazelon at the U.S. Court of Appeal in Washington, D.C. Later, he served in the Kennedy administration as assistant, I have to read because it's too complicated, as Assistant General Counsel in the Office of President's Special Representative for Trade Negotiations. Then he was Legislative Assistant of the Democratic Senator Joseph Tidings from Maryland, working as major projects to two acts passed by the Congress that I would like to mention to you. The first act was the Omnibus Crime Control Act, passed by the Congress in 1968, whose effect was, among many others, to prohibit interstate trade in handguns. And this act increased the minimum age of buyers of handguns to 21. And the other act I would like to mention is the Civil Rights Act, passed in 1968, through which the Congress provide equal housing opportunities, quindi un sistema di case popolari, regardless of race, creed, or national origin. And this is a landmark historical piece of legislation that was signed by President Lyndon Johnson just during the riots after the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King in 1968. After teaching in Chicago and in Michigan, Bob Burt joined the Yale Law School faculty in 1976, right? Okay, and he started teaching constitutional law. He's been member of so many boards and foundations and institutions that I can only mention a few just to give you the idea of his engagement. He's been member of the National Academy of Science Committee on Inborn Errors of Metabolism, member of the advisory board of the Project on Death in America of the Open Society Institute, member of the Institute of Medicine, serving on the committees on care at the end of life and on ethical and public policy issues in xenograft transplantation. Xenograft transplantation sono quei trapianti a beneficio degli esseri umani ma utilizzando organi che provengono da animali, quindi come immaginate un sacco di questioni etiche, morali, giuridiche che sorgano da quei casi. I happened to be one of Bob Burt's students at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, well, let's say several years ago, okay, without being more precise. And I had the very, very good fortune of working under his supervision during my stay at Yale. And I have to say that I was impressed by his always very calm, but very passionate and inspiring way of teaching, and his rare sensitivity to handle controversial and dilemmatic issues. And I'm honored that he accepted our invitation, and I do thank him for his being here. And what else? Well, I think that's it. Was I precise about your career?
Oh, you were excessive.
Okay, so I talk too long, I talk too much, and just a couple of practical, questi magari li dico in italiano perché sono più pratici, magari possono. Allora, per gli studenti che hanno bisogno eventualmente di farsi riconoscere i crediti per questa iniziativa, c'è un registro che va firmato, c'è un registro che ha Ilaria qui e che va firmato all'inizio e alla fine di ogni lezione. Vedrete che dovete lasciare l'indirizzo di posta elettronica al quale a coloro tra di voi che frequenteranno tutte e tre le lezioni verrà spedito l'attestato di partecipazione a queste lezioni, attraverso il quale potrete eventualmente richiedere il riconoscimento dei crediti ciascuno di voi nel corso, naturalmente nel corso proprio di studi. L'ordine delle lezioni è cambiato perché oggi cominceremo con The Insanity Offense, che era prevista come secondo appuntamento, domani ci sarà Disease, Disruption and Homosexuality, e poi ci sarà la terza lezione che ha cambiato titolo e che si chiamerà, in maniera molto evocativa, Freedom from Fear. Al termine della lezione di oggi, dopo che forse vi sarete resi conto che la lezione che avrete ascoltato non è esattamente ciò che ci si aspetta da un professore di diritto, come è tradizione per gli Alberico Gentili Lectures, io e Burt avremo una conversazione intervista. Come vedete ci sono 2 sedie preparate qui, proprio per percorrere, diciamo, l'esperienza di diversità che il professor Burt può aver avuto nella sua vita, e per capire che tipo di propellente, che tipo di stimolo è stato per il perseguimento dei suoi obiettivi. Non mi resta che lasciare la parola al professor Burt e grazie moltissimo ancora per essere qua e spero buon divertimento. Grazie.
Well, thank you, Bene, for that glowing recommendation to you, and thank you, too, for inviting me, and Rector, thank you for extending the hospitality of the entire university, and thanks, too, may I say, to the Studio Lucchetti for their assistance in bringing this about. Bene has mentioned to you the kind of underlying sense of the invitation to kind of do something new, push a little bit beyond the borders of what I've already done and thought. And I took advantage of that. It's the fact that I'm trying to push the borders of my own thinking will raise some problems for us here, and I want to flag them at the beginning. The first problem is one of language. I wish that I spoke Italian. I don't at all, so you're way ahead of me in terms of having 2 languages. At the same time, what I'm going to talk about some of the time, not all of the time, but some of the time will be material that's, I think, a little new to many of you, and a little complicated as well. I promise to you that I've done my best to make these thoughts as clear as possible. And actually today's lecture, I think, will have more in it that is unaccustomed to you. I'm going to spend some time in the middle of the lecture setting out Freud's theory of mind. And now, all of you, I assume, have heard of Sigmund Freud. I doubt that many of you have studied his theory of mind intensely. In the short time that I have here, I'll do my best to convey what I have in mind. But as Benedetta and I talked about this lecture before, we decided to try something a little novel, or perhaps, if not too novel, helpful to you. And that is, at 2 times during the lecture today, I'm going to stop, and she's going to come back to the podium and give you kind of a 5-minute summary in Italian of what I have just been saying to you in English. So as a way of kind of trying to bring us all along. So let's see how it works. Today's lecture, as she said, and I had enough Italian to figure out that she told you that the order is not what it was previously announced. So today's lecture is the insanity of offense. So let me just plunge into it. And I should say, too, if any of you have trouble hearing me, although I think the microphone is working well enough, but if you do, raise your hand and I will just kind of speak louder, if not clearer. So if your hand is raised because you don't, I'm not speaking clearly enough, that's my problem. But if it's loud enough, I can always get louder. So I want to start by setting out kind of the basic perspective that I bring to the 3 lectures today. And it's more of a question and an attitude than it is a set of doctrinaire beliefs. But the basic belief that I come to this lecture with is that when one thinks about law and legal regulation, you must inevitably have in the back of your mind a kind of vision of human psychology, of how the mind works. Now, for most of the time in legal education, at least in the United States, the assumption is, well, the mind works rationally. We're all rational beings, we reason together, and with our rational minds, we calculate the best advantage for each of us. We become utility maximizers, as the economist lawyers would say. And that's the last thought that one has about the psychology, the theory of mind that you have, and then we kind of spin off into all kinds of finger exercises, one might say, or at least thoughts. But I want to stop at this attitude of rationality and deepen it, because it seems to me it is only partial. It's half the story, and sometimes it's not even half the story. So in the next 3 days, what I hope to do is to build up a richer theory of mind that takes into account the irrational, the passions that guide us, that grab us, that sometimes overwhelm our rational capacities, and sometimes work in harmony with them. The basic premise that I start with is this. I believe that there is a direct connection between the cognitive functioning of individual human beings and the collective construction of the social order. The ordinary way of thinking is, well, as individuals we're over here, and then there's social relations, but I believe that there's a connection and an interaction between individual minds and what I might call the collective minds. Now, our individual brains are constantly bombarded by sensory perceptions that have no intrinsic structure or meaning. We construct meaning. We give order to disordered perceptions. And one of the ways that we use for bestowing meaningful order is through our mutual depiction of our social relationships with one another. So that, at an abstract level, is the kind of basic premise that I offer you. And in the next 3 days, I hope to flesh this out so that you see at least what I have in mind. And then you can evaluate it for yourself as to its plausibility. In this first lecture, I will restrict my attention to individual psychology. In the next 2, I will move from what I have to say, my views about individual psychology, into exploring how, in our mutual social relations, we steer a path with one another and for one another to give order and coherence to our thinking, to our cognitive processes. But as I say today, I want to focus on individual psychology as if we stood alone, isolated from and not dependent on a social network. This is an artificial division. Tomorrow I will show how deeply interrelated we all are, how much we are dependent on our social relationships for establishing our sense of cognitive coherence. But before I can try to demonstrate the depth of this mutual dependence, I must first show you what I believe to be the nature of the problem that our intricately interwoven network of social relationships is meant to solve. The most vivid expression of the problem that I will describe to you is in our conception of insanity, and that will be the focus of my lecture today. Now, when we say that an individual is insane, we mean fundamentally that he is unable to tell the difference between fantasy and reality. So, for example, a schizophrenic person hears voices and imagines that they are commanding him to do something or are harshly criticizing him, whereas a sane person, an objective observer, knows that these voices are not real, they're not external phenomenon, but they are instead products of the schizophrenic's own mind. Some people are afflicted by physical abnormalities in their brains that produce psychotic delusions, and contemporary advances in neuroscience promise to give us more detailed and accurate account of these abnormalities. But my concern today is not with people whose brain structure is abnormal. My concern today is with those of us who have essentially normal brain structures, but nonetheless experience some difficulty in distinguishing between fantasy and reality, between waking life and dreams. My fundamental claim today is that this group is not simply a large number of people. This group constitutes everyone who has a normal brain structure. That is to say, everyone in this room has difficulty distinguishing between dreams and wakefulness, between fantasy and reality. That may seem an overstatement to you, but by the time we're done, I hope you see what I mean and how it applies to you in your own thinking. We normal people solve or at least cover over this difficulty in distinguishing fantasy and reality, waking life and dreams, in our elaborate networks of social interactions. But the problem that our social relationships are meant to solve is embedded in the very structure of our individual cognitive functioning. Now, this may seem to you like a crazy idea on my part. I ask you to bear with me that I may seem crazy, but in the end, maybe we're all a little crazy. But let's be crazy together. I want to develop this idea by exploring the treatment of insanity in Anglo-American criminal law. And in this exploration, I hope to show you the deep truth beneath this seemingly crazy idea that we all have difficulty distinguishing between awakeness and dream life. Now, the basic formula for identifying criminal insanity in Anglo-American jurisprudence originated in an 1843 ruling by the British House of Lords in the McNaughton case, famous case, foundational case in insanity and the law. In the McNaughton case, the High Court held that an accused criminal should be presumed sane and therefore, quote, responsible for his crimes unless he was, quote, laboring under a defect of reason from disease of the mind. Now, if the House of Lords had stopped there, one could argue that they had turned the question of criminal responsibility over to the neuroscientists. But the McNaughton Court went further. Not every form of mental disease was exculpatory, denied responsibility. The court held only such disease of the mind as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. This specification that mental illness sometimes excused criminality, but sometimes didn't, was the beginning of an uneasy relationship between the law and neuroscience that has only gotten more frayed with passing time. Since 1843, voluminous amounts of ink have been spilled over the question of the best formulation of the insanity defense, trying, among other things, to delineate the proper boundary of the relationship between law and neuroscience. The fundamental premise for almost all of these efforts has been that what the law calls insanity is not identical to what neuroscientists or psychiatrists call mental disease. This premise has become ever more urgent as neuroscience has more confidently proclaimed that all behavior, not just mentally ill behavior, but all, is the product of neuronal activity in the brain. From a neuroscientific perspective, all abnormal behavior, which includes socially aberrational behavior, can be understood as the product of abnormal neuronal activity, or that is, a product of brain disease. Now, from the law's perspective, this is an intolerable conclusion. If all socially aberrational conduct arises from brain disease, and if brain disease is a defense to criminal charges of moral culpability, then no offender can be morally culpable, and everyone must be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The law's attempt to distinguish among different kinds of aberrational conduct relies on an underlying assertion that some individuals are able to control their conduct and others are not. But from a neuroscientific perspective, what is the mechanism of this self-control? If neural mechanisms govern all conduct, what is the neuron or cluster of neurons that govern an individual's capacity for self-control? Is there some master neuron which the self can voluntarily turn on or off? But from a neuroscientific perspective, the self's manipulation of neuronal switching is itself dictated by neuronal activities. We are thus in the grip of an infinite regress. The law poses a question about who does and who does not have capacity for self-control, and from a neuroscientific perspective, the question framed in this way is unanswerable, incoherent. From a neuroscientific perspective, it seems that either no one has this capacity or everyone has it. From the law's perspective, this is no answer at all. The conventional response to this mismatch between neuroscience and the law has been to tinker with the law's question so that somehow the two disciplines can find some common language. But I want to explore the possibility of a different response. I want to accept the proposition that the law's conception of self-control is itself incoherent, that the very idea of a unified, hierarchically superior, reflectively choice-making self contains an internal contradiction. The contradiction cannot be resolved, and yet most people find this contradiction very troubling, and most social regulatory activity betrays an unwillingness, an incapacity to accept this contradiction as insoluble. We should, I believe, take a different path. We should abandon the effort to identify the characteristics of the self-controlling self, to draw a firm distinction between insane and sane people, and instead acknowledge that the internal contradiction in the very concept of the self-controlling self is a distinctive human characteristic, a characteristic of human cognition, and that the contradictions is fundamentally constitutive of our cognitive process. Now, there are two pathways toward this acknowledgement that I want to pursue with you, in the hopes perhaps of clarifying, making less abstract what I have said so far. The first pathway is marked by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor in his superb book, Sources of the Self, The Making of the Modern Identity, which he published in 1989. Taylor identifies what he calls the continuing philosophic discomfort with the post-Enlightenment conception of the self. And he locates the source of this discomfort in its confusing shift between radical objectivity and radical subjectivity within the very conceptual structure of the self. Human beings can observe themselves from a third-person perspective, as if we are watching ourselves and regulating our own conduct. Or we can experience ourselves from a first-person perspective. That is to say, I'm an actor, but I'm not an actor that's observing myself, I just act. As Taylor says, however, the two perspectives are incommensurate. They start from different premises. Most notably, the two perspectives start from different premises about the separateness of self and other, and they lead to radically different mental representations of the individual and collective worlds. Now, in the course of this lecture, I'm going to develop this idea of the distinction between self and other. It may seem self-evident. To our rational minds, it is self-evident. Here am I am different from you, and you are different from him, and she is different from her. So, of course, the self and the other are different. But you will see as I develop, and particularly as I delve into Freudian thinking, that this is only one part of our mind that truly believes that you and I are separate, and you are separate from him, and so forth. There's another part of our mind, and that's what I hope to explore more, which denies that simple appearing rational fact, and instead instructs us, as it were, that we are not separate. So part of our mind we are, but part of our minds we are not. Now, Taylor characterized the defining difference between the pre-modern and post-Enlightenment modern views of the self in a very vivid way. He said that the self-objectifying modern self stands in a place already hollowed out for God. He takes a stance to the world which befits an image of the deity. When God is firmly in his place, the unstable, incommensurate distinction between the third party and the first party perspective in human thought is stabilized. The way this happens is that God is believed to embody the third person perspective. That is, he controls and observes us. We, in turn, embody the first person perspective, observed and controlled by him. The conceptual instability that Taylor speaks of occurs when God disappears from the equation, and when these two perspectives of radical objectivity and radical subjectivity are thought to exist in a single entity that is the modern self. Put another way, when God is the creator and we are the objects of his creation, it's easy to identify the uncaused cause in a hierarchical structure of the universe. Now again, the search for the uncaused cause is a central problem that the existence of God solves for us. Without God's presence, we then say, well, who caused everything around us? And who caused us? And the answer that the modern self says is, well, we caused everything. But then who caused that? So you're back in this infinite regress without a stopping point. Belief in God solved this infinite regress. Today, it solved it in this sense. God is the originator who causes everything to happen, but nothing or no one has caused him to come into being. God is the uncaused cause. But if God disappeared, or is in hiding and unavailable, who or what takes his place as the uncaused cause? Taylor said that in post-Enlightenment modern thought, we have taken God's place. But if that is so, how can we cause us? Unless we're somehow a divinity, which we know we are not. Now, this problem, this modern instability, in my view, afflicts people, even people who firmly believe in God. Clearly the problem afflicts atheists or agnostics, but this modern virus, if I can call it that, has so affected us in terms of our conception of the self that even those who believe in God, except those who kind of mindlessly believe in God, have some problem with this issue of the uncaused cause. And yet, a fervent belief in God solves the problem. for those who are willing to see it as a soluble problem. Now, this search for the uncaused cause is at the core of the law's secular struggle to define the insanity defense. In the terms of the insanity defense, no matter what its variations in formulation, sane conduct is viewed as freely willed by the individual. He is, in effect, the uncaused cause of his own conduct. Insane conduct is, from this perspective, not free, but is caused by some superior force or external force, by mental disease or defect. When we see the contemporary image of the self through Taylor's eyes as a secular response to the apparent emptiness of what he calls the place already hollowed out for God, we can see how the idea of free will became a centrally prized element of human conduct. Hence the passion that attends the debate about the existence and definition of the self-controlling self in the criminal law. Much more than a practical question about the proper disposition of socially dangerous people is at stake. The very existence of the category of freely willed actions, of free actors, must be vindicated. The meaningfulness of the world depends on it. This is one pathway, a philosopher's pathway, for understanding why the law's struggle with the issue of insanity is deeply unsettling regarding the coherence of our entire contemporary conception of the universe. I next want to turn to another pathway, and that's Sigmund Freud's pathway to dealing with the same problem. But before I do that, I want to step off the podium, give it to Bene, and wish her best of luck in summarizing in 5 minutes or less what I just said.
Allora, se vi sentite completamente smarriti è normale, nel senso che questo era l'effetto che Bob aveva già previsto per tutti, perché è abbastanza insane quello che sta cercando di spiegarci. Allora, proverò a riassumerlo in pochissimi minuti. Allora, nasce un problema molto controverso quando si confronta la prospettiva giuridica della responsabilità con la determinazione neurologica dei nostri comportamenti. Cosa vuol dire questo? Vuol dire che se una persona commette un crimine, anche un crimine aberrante nei confronti di qualcuno della società, eccetera, i termini attraverso i quali quella persona viene indicata responsabile della sua condotta sono termini naturalmente che non riguardano una situazione patologica, cioè se una persona è pazza vuol dire che non era capace di controllare i suoi comportamenti, quindi se è pazza non è responsabile di quello che fa. Se invece non è pazza, non ha quindi alcuna forma patologica, evidentemente può essere sottoposta alla responsabilità giuridica che gli deve essere riconosciuta con la pena poi combinata. Questo è come funziona normalmente, la prospettiva giuridica. Se si confronta la prospettiva giuridica con quella delle neuroscienze, la confusione è massima, perché un neuroscienziato che studi il funzionamento del cervello sostiene che qualsiasi comportamento umano è dovuto al meccanismo neuronale che c'è dietro, come se noi fossimo completamente impossessati o dominati dai meccanismi che avvengono a livello neuronale nel nostro cervello. Allora, mettere insieme queste due cose è abbastanza, non so se è abbastanza, confondente, perché se è vero che noi siamo sempre, che i nostri comportamenti sono sempre il frutto di un meccanismo neuronale, noi non siamo mai responsabili di quello che facciamo. Sia che io decida di uscire da questa aula magna e mettermi un cappotto anche se è molto caldo, sia che io decida di piantare un pugnale dietro la schiena di qualcuno, in ogni caso, secondo le diverse gradualità, ma ciò che noi facciamo è frutto di un comportamento neuronale che noi non possiamo controllare, no? Allora, il neuroscienziato e il giurista difficilmente riescono a trovare un middle ground, no? Sotto questo punto di vista, perché se il giurista accettasse le conclusioni del neuroscienziato, naturalmente tutte le corti penali degli ordinamenti non avrebbero più niente da accettare, nessuna responsabilità da accettare. Se il neuroscienziato accettasse quello che il giurista propone, ovviamente metterebbe in discussione il funzionamento stesso del cervello con i suoi meccanismi neuronali. Allora, quello che il professor Burt, quello che Burt vorrebbe cercare, diciamo, di affrontare, e ha già cominciato in questa prima lezione, è cercare di dimostrare che in qualche modo tutti noi, a prescindere che aderiamo o meno alla visione, diciamo, delle neuroscienze, tutti noi siamo un pochino pazzi. Cosa vuol dire che ciascuno di noi è un pochino pazzo? Vuol dire che ciascuno di noi non ha un pieno controllo sulle sue azioni. Allora, se il pazzo è colui che non distingue la verità dalla fantasia, che non distingue le voci vere dalle voci che ritiene di sentire intorno a sé, vi sembrerà un'affermazione, diciamo, forte, e lo è, ma senza naturalmente arrivare a livelli patologici. Probabilmente ognuno di noi, in una circostanza o in un'altra, si trova in situazioni simili, cioè in situazioni in cui non riesce a distinguere bene la realtà dalla fantasia. E per spiegare, diciamo, questa spaccatura che c'è in ciascuno di noi, farà riferimento a due prospettive possibili di lettura di questa cosa. La prima, di cui ha già parlato, è la prospettiva di un filosofo. La seconda sarà la prospettiva di uno psicanalista, quindi di Freud, diciamo, come padre della psicanalisi. Allora, per ricostruire, diciamo, la visione filosofica, Burt ha fatto riferimento ad un grande filosofo vivente canadese, insegna McGill, che si chiama Charles Taylor e che ha scritto un libro che si chiama Sources of the Self, quindi le origini del sé. E attraverso una lunga, diciamo, carrellata storica, Taylor racconta com'è cambiata la percezione per ciascuno di noi del proprio sé e della propria identità, e riconosce il grande spartiacque che avrebbe cambiato la storia della percezione della nostra individuale, diciamo, identità nel momento della secolarizzazione dello Stato e della società. Cioè, prima di quel momento, prima cioè che Dio, qualsiasi Dio, ma diciamo venisse eliminato dalla scena pubblica, anche dalla scena istituzionale, prima cioè che Dio venisse svuotato del senso identitario che aveva prima per le persone, ciascuno guardava se stesso con uno sguardo soggettivo, cioè io sono io. Adesso sembra che sono, diciamo così, che vado verso derive impossibili, ma insomma, quando Dio era contemplato nella presenza naturale, normale per ciascun essere vivente, Dio era l'essere che mi guardava da una prospettiva esterna. Cioè io sono io, mi giudico da solo, io guardo a me stesso, però so che il mio è uno sguardo di me verso di me, quindi è uno sguardo interno. Sapevo però che c'era qualcuno in grado di osservare i miei comportamenti dall'esterno, da una posizione di terzietà, e quel qualcuno era senz'altro Dio, perché Dio faceva ancora parte delle istituzioni, faceva parte della vita comune, perché nessuno si era sognato di pensare e di proporre che la vita degli uomini potesse essere svuotata dalla presenza di Dio. Poi, diciamo, a partire dal tardo Settecento in là, la presenza, diciamo, della divinità cambia ruolo nella vita ordinaria, nella vita istituzionale, nella percezione comune. Dio non è più una presenza così immanente, così scontata. C'è qualcuno che ci crede, c'è qualcuno che non ci crede, qualcuno pensa che esista, qualcuno che pensa che non esista. In che modo questa cosa ha determinato una diversa percezione dell'identità personale? In questo senso, perché se io dubito che Dio esista da lassù e che è lo sguardo terzo su di me, in qualche modo, filosoficamente parlando, è come se il sé, l'individuo, fosse stato chiamato a riempire quel vuoto. E quindi l'individualità, da quando Dio, diciamo, è stato svuotato della sua funzione pubblica, l'individuo è chiamato allo stesso sguardo intimista e autoriflesso di prima, ma adesso anche ad avere uno sguardo su di sé oggettivo, cioè come se io fossi esterno. ha senso quello che stiamo dicendo in due lingue diverse, ma che stiamo dicendo. Allora, come immaginate essere una persona che a tratti ha uno sguardo su di sé autoriflesso, cioè io sono io, e a tratti una persona ha uno sguardo su di sé che è terzo, che è proverò a fare un esempio, diciamo, pratico. Quando ci chiediamo, per esempio, se è giusto qualcosa, possiamo avere due diverse prospettive per decidere se una certa condotta per noi possa essere giusta o meno. La prima prospettiva è una prospettiva, diciamo così, rispetto a quello che sento. Non so, sono arrabbiata con una persona, quindi ho intenzione di tenere una certa condotta con quella persona. Questo è quello che sento, è come io vengo determinato, come mi percepisco da quello che mi nasce dentro. Poi, una volta le persone avrebbero pensato che c'era, come dire, qualcun altro fuori che li avrebbe potuti aiutare ad attraversare questa esperienza. Adesso in qualche modo Dio non c'è più. E quindi io devo uscire da me per guardare il comportamento che io voglio tenere, la situazione nella quale mi trovo e stabilire se è una condotta giusta oppure no. Allora, in questa oscillazione costante tra un sé che guarda a sé in maniera soggettiva e un sé che in qualche misura esce dall'individuo per guardarlo con uno sguardo di terzietà, in questa oscillazione sta naturalmente una spaccatura del sé che rappresenta, come dire, un tipo di alternativa tra ciò che è vero e ciò che è immaginario. Ciò che è davvero concreto e ciò che invece è frutto in qualche misura delle nostre costruzioni. Io penso, questa è diciamo la visuale che possiamo leggere da una prospettiva filosofica. Adesso naturalmente c'è la prospettiva psicanalitica, cioè come la psicanalisi, che in parte naturalmente si innesta nella morte di Dio. Non a caso le dottrine di Freud all'inizio erano dottrine ostracizzate, messe al bando, condannate, perché ovviamente la dottrina di Freud fa sì che Dio, nella definizione dell'identità di ciascuno di noi, non sia una presenza indispensabile, perché noi possiamo controllare e non controllare il nostro operato, giudicare in un modo o in un altro il nostro operato senza bisogno di uno sguardo esterno. Quindi adesso lascio, se siete, come dire, poi ci sarà modo, se volete, spero, di fare domande, e se vi sentite spiazzati vuol dire che sta funzionando. Va bene?
Okay.
Okay.
So, that brings us to Freud. And I want to use now Freud and to enlarge in a way on the philosopher Charles Taylor's account of the essential incoherence of the modern concept of a unitary self. Now, Freud was the first to map out this pathway in terms of the structure of mind. In many places, especially in America today, Freud is widely debunked as an unscientific, misogynistic, uptight, Victorian bourgeois gentleman. The only good word in that sentence is gentleman. I don't know where he stands in Italian culture today. I hope that your culture is not automatically as debunking toward him as my culture is, because although there's a lot of dirty bathwater here, there's a very lovely little baby that is quite a subject of admiration. Now, there are many elements of Freud's thinking that are unsupportable and that have been abandoned even amongst modern practitioners of psychoanalysis. His dismissive attitude toward women, especially in the idea of penis envy. His insistence that heterosexual genital intercourse is the ultimate expression of psychological health. His original conception of the psychological mechanisms by which psychoanalysis cures neuroses All of this and more in Freud's thought have not survived the test of time. It is, however, a serious mistake to dismiss Freud because of these shortcomings in the details of his understanding of mental processes. He was digging in virgin fields, if I can use the double sense of it, and it's not surprising that, original as he was, he stumbled here and again. But to pursue the metaphor that Freud gives us a pathway, these shortcomings, in my view, are like underbrush, which, when you clear it away, reveals a firm, well-marked foundation. Freud's great discovery was the existence of human cognition of both conscious and unconscious thought, and the fact that, by its very definition, unconscious thinking is outside conscious awareness, and indeed is never fully accessible to it, though dimly glimpsed in dream states. But, Freud discovered, unconscious thoughts, though we are unaware of them, pervasively influence our waking conduct. Moreover, the powerful influence of unconscious thoughts of which we are unaware, is not an illness, it's not a neurosis which requires cure, but is a normal, inescapable, and universal characteristic of human cognition. Now, Freud saw all of this intuitively, derived from his observation of his patients' thought processes and his own. He didn't know the neural mechanisms that produced these results, and only very recently have modern neuroscientists developed some rudimentary means for observing a small portion of these mechanisms. The problem, of course, was that until very recently, to study the brain, you had to have a dead person. And studying the dead brain doesn't tell you anything about the live brain. It's only very recently now, with MRIs and new ways of non-invasively kind of detecting what's going on in the brain, that we can begin, though it is just at this moment still a beginning, to investigate how the waking brain works. But to reject Freud's conception of the unconscious because he didn't understand its neural mechanisms would be equivalent to rejecting Charles Darwin's insights into the role of heredity in the evolution of species because he didn't understand the genetic mechanism by which heredity takes place. It was only in the 1950s that the very idea of the gene became coherent, and suddenly you had the mechanism of inheritance that explained how Darwin's theory of the evolution of species works. And we are just now at the same point in understanding Freud's conception of the unconscious. We just now have the instrument to detect it, and indeed, within the last 5-7 years, actually, we have observed unconscious thinking at work in the laboratory for the first time. So it's an exciting moment, but it also underscores that Freud was on to something. And without going into the details of the neural experiments, what has been shown using kind of a magnetic resonance imaging is that conscious activity is preceded by clear activity in the brain, which the subject doesn't know is happening. We don't know what the content is, but we know it exists, and that's Freud's basic insight. The existence of unconscious thinking and its influence on waking conduct is the only element in Freud's thinking that I will rely upon for the remainder of these lectures. Now, the idea that there is an unconscious and that it is at work in all of us may seem an uncontroversial fact to you, so much so that it might seem implausible that this was only discovered by one man little more than 100 years ago. But like many great insights, this idea has become widely accepted, and in this very acceptance has been stripped of its unsettling implications. People say, well, of course there's unconscious thinking, like slips of the tongue. This is one of the things that Freud used to illustrate the fact that there is unconscious thinking going on. So he had a whole book devoted, he called it The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. He had many examples. The one that sticks to mind is the chairman of a meeting, he brings the gavel down, and he's at this meeting, and he doesn't want to be at the meeting, and he's very worried about what's going to happen. It's very chaotic. I guess it's like choosing a new government for Italy. The chair of the meeting wishes it weren't happening, but it has to happen. And so it gets recorded element in Freud's day in Vienna. So the chairman takes the gavel and says, I hereby end the meeting. I mean, begin the meeting. And Freud says this is not without meaning. Everything for Freud is with meaning. And so, if he lays the chairman down on the couch and has him free associate, pretty soon, pretty quickly, I think, the chairman is going to say, I really wished that this meeting was over before it started, and it slipped out. That was my unconscious speaking. It's a Freudian slip. So, we all know about these things, including, at least in English, I don't know in Italian if there's the same word for Freudian slip. But it's gone into our language, and yet it's been stripped, as I say, of its unsettling implications, like a wolf domesticated into a lap dog. And what I want to do for the remainder of this lecture, and really the next two lectures as well, is to restore the wolf-like, deeply disturbing implications of Freud's conception of unconscious thinking. And if we fully appreciate the significance of unconscious thinking, our beliefs about the possibility of rational decision-making, either by individuals or by collectivities, must be radically revised. This is an especially disruptive implication for lawyers and the legal system. As I said at the beginning, the idea of rational decision-making by individuals and collectivities is a fundamental underpinning for conventional legal thinking. Rationality, both as a realistic possibility and as a normative aspiration. This conventional idea cannot be sustained if Freud was correct, as I believe he was, in his understanding of the existence and working of unconscious thinking. Now, to grasp this, we've got to spend some time setting out the building blocks of Freud's idea. Freud posited that there are two radically inconsistent modes of thinking that are present in every individual's mind. He called these two modes primary process and secondary process thinking. Primary process, as the designation implies, comes first in every individual's psychological development. It is the way that newborns perceive the world. The essential premise of primary process thinking is that there is no distinction between self and other, that the infant and the external world are all the same, and that anything the infant imagines is real. This is not illogical thinking. There is a clear logic to it if you start with the premise that there is no distinction between self and other. Freud characterized this mode of thinking as infantile omnipotence. This is a world where there is no distinction between waking thoughts and dreaming. From a third-party objective perspective, this conceptualization is crazy. From the infant's radically subjective perspective, this makes perfect sense. This radical subjectivity, this primary process thinking, moreover, is not unconscious thinking. The infant is aware of his belief in his magical omnipotence, but he never formulates the belief in propositional terms. He lacks the conceptual capacity to do this. Indeed, the only way he could say to himself, I am omnipotent, is if he could view himself from a third-party perspective. But this is exactly the capacity that he lacks. He is unable to see himself as such because he has no capacity to distinguish himself from others, no capacity to distinguish the external world from his internal thoughts, no capacity to differentiate between waking and dreaming. Now, let me pause for a moment here. Now, Freud had no magic MRI machine to measure what was in a newborn infant's mind. We still don't. Indeed, we have no measurement technique to identify the content of any of our thinking. But this idea that primary process thinking is characteristic of the newborn and comes first has a powerful common sense basis to it. If you accept the proposition that an infant is born with capacity for thinking, not rational thought necessarily, but just cognition. Then you have to ask yourself, well, at some point in the womb, this capacity comes into play. And by cognition, we just mean, there's sensory impressions that are coming in here. That somehow I want to make sense out of. That's the initial premise. Then you have to ask yourself, well, where does the newborn learn that there's a distinction between himself and other people and the world? Where does the newborn learn that his mother and he are not identical? Well, certainly not in the womb. He's not going to learn that. He's not going to learn that for a very simple reason, because there is no distinction between himself and his mother. He's tangled up inside her body and hooked up by, tubes, and so then he emerges. Suddenly does he say, "Oh, hi, Mom, it's nice to see you," and think of her as a separate being? And the answer has, just from a common sense point of view, he has to learn it somehow. But it's not where he starts. He starts believing in his magical omnipotence, if you want to put it that way. And the magical omnipotence extends to, at the very beginning, if I have an idea, then it's real. What's the difference between waking and dreaming? What's the difference between fantasy and reality? Not for us adults, because we can understand that, and I'll talk a little more about that, but from the newborn's perspective. There is no, if what looks like a thought comes into his head, why should he think that it's only my thought? It's crazy thinking. My own fantasy. It's not the real world. The idea of the real world is a later development. Part of the belief system of the very early infant is he's hungry, the breast appears. Where did it come from? It just appears. And then he stops crying because he's taking at the breast. This is magical omnipotent thinking at the beginning. The breast appeared because I wanted it. The breast appeared because I'm hungry. I felt the hunger pains. I then spoke physiologically about the hunger pains, and magically a breast appears. Wow, that's pretty good. Until it doesn't happen again. Because the mom's on the telephone, or she's away for the weekend, or she's working at the office. Where is this breast? So maybe there's a flaw here. The infant says, maybe just because I think of it doesn't mean that it will happen. So then the learning process continues. Maybe there's an association, and that again we can see associational learning going on, not just from newborn human beings, but all kinds of species of rough and ready associations. But maybe the next step is that the newborn says, well, I know I'm crying. I know there's some noise coming from somewhere. And then the breast appears. Now the noise comes from hunger pains, and it's physical discomfort. But some association then comes to be learned, not instantly, between a noise appearing from somewhere, okay? And then the breast appears. You break it down step by step. So where did the noise come from? Well, that's the beginning of learning that there's a separate self. I made that noise. I can make it again. And the breast appears. The breast appears, except when it doesn't. And let me say again, jumping over a lot of developmental steps, that's when we learn the efficacy of language. Why bother to have language if you get everything that you want without even asking for it? So the crying turns into the infant saying, gee, when I make this noise, then in comes the mother, and then the mother makes babble, which we hear as, oh, well, you're hungry. She's saying something. Now, you all know how long it takes the baby to put words together to objects, but this is the unfolding process. And through series of repeated disappointments, the infant learns that he is not omnipotent, that his primary process, that is to say, the first way that he learns to speak, doesn't work totally for him. And he must put aside or so rational thinking says, he must put aside childish things and view the world on the premise that there is this distinction between self and other. That wanting milk doesn't mean that it will come, that he has to make some action to persuade a separate human being to give him what he's looking for. So that's the grounding for believing in the difference between self and other. But one would look at this from a rational perspective and say, okay, he starts out with primary process thinking, but he pretty soon learns it's not working. And so what does he do? He learns to speak. Then the next thing he learns when he wants some milk is to go to the grocery store, maybe to milk a cow himself. And in this process, he says, gosh, was I wrong at the beginning? So let's get rid of primary process thinking. I don't know how I ever came to that. It's a really stupid idea. But from henceforth now, everything is going to be premised on the existence of the difference between self and other. And the old known is erased. It's just gone. Freud had a different idea, and here's where his great challenge and great originality and great disruption of our ordinary thinking comes in. Now, in his terms, there is indeed a learning process that the infant goes through, and the infant's repeated disappointment does lead him to a new premise to embrace what he calls secondary process thinking, which we also call rational objectivity, based on objective separateness between himself and the world. But, according to Freud, though the infant learns this new way of thinking, this new learning does not lead him to abandon his old way of thinking. He does not do what an objective third-party observer might expect. That is, to learn from experience and abandon or erase his prior erroneous thinking accordingly. Freud posits that nothing is ever erased from memory, but that old memories and new thoughts are stored in the mind, and that in particular, the old way of thinking, primary process thinking, is never lost, but is embedded in a part of the mind that Freud called the unconscious. Now, this too is what modern neuroscience is just on the edge of kind of looking at. That is to say, the workings of memory. But enough work has been done to correspond to Freud's initial insight. That is to say, everything that comes in, or at least everything that is salient to the creature, and there's some disagreement amongst neuroscientists whether everything is put into memory. It hooks up with the neurons that are responsible for memory, or whether there's some initial screening if some things don't get through at all, like the feeling of your heartbeat, let's say. We are inattentive to many things, but we're attentive to huge numbers of things nonetheless in our environment. I mean, right now you are all feeling attentive to the warmth of your bodies, or the smells in the room, or the pictures around. But you are being selective in what you're attending to, because otherwise you would be overwhelmed. Or, on the other hand, you might say, well, it's more fun to look at the pictures in the room at Burt's lecture. But still, you would be making an attention decision, as it were. But typically, there are thousands of attention decisions coming at us, and we make them at a level beneath consciousness. But some stuff gets through. But then not all stuff that gets through is relevant to action in terms of what you're interested in. So some stuff gets diverted in memory and lodged in what becomes a separate part of the mind, which Freud called the unconscious. Now, he kind of had a diagrammatic picture of the mind, which doesn't stand up. I mean, there is no locus in the mind of the unconscious. It's instead in the complex neuronal interactions that one finds the preservation of memories, and that memories are pervasive, and memories make up the unconscious. And when we have thoughts that precede our conscious thoughts, one of the things that we're doing is screening. It's like running a film fast forward, screening all the memories that are associated with my wish for milk, let's say. I was thirsty a minute ago, I took some water. Somewhere in my memory traces were the fact that when I get thirsty, my mother somehow magically appears. So it's still there, but I run through it with incredible rapidity. And that's the simple idea, if you will. Now, the brain, in effect, compartmentalizes. Just talking about being thirsty, you see, makes me thirsty. So excuse me while I commune with my mother's milk. Freud posited that the brain, in effect, compartmentalizes its conscious and unconscious thought processes. But these compartments are not rigidly differentiated. Every conscious thought is also processed through the unconscious. Every perception is thus experienced through radically inconsistent premises. One derived from primary process, when the infant imagined himself to be omnipotent and imaginable, and the other derived from secondary process, when the infant said, I'm not omnipotent. I have to somehow persuade others who are separate from me to do what I want them to do. But I do it, understanding that they don't automatically know what I want. So when the baby cries and the mother then says, I can't help you if you don't tell me what it is. Is your diaper wet? So this is the beginning of the baby learning to negotiate. And on the one hand, it's an enormous power, and that's why you lawyers are here, because you are particularly adept at verbalization and persuading people to give you what you want, and that's what we train you as. So on the one hand, this capacity to act on the premise of the separateness of the self and others, which creates the need to persuade them, is a source of great strength. On the other hand, it's a great weakness. Because in the old days, all you had to do was think and it appeared. Now, why can't we go back to that? Lots of people, certainly me, as my wife would very much tell you, is kind of caught in that dilemma. If I just think it, you should give me what I want. Because after all, we're married, right? But pretty quickly, this grown-up infant learns, you gotta negotiate, discuss, persuade, because that's the way it goes. Now, common sense may dictate that in the juxtaposition between primary process and secondary process thinking, or what we would call between rational and irrational, or what we would call radical subjectivity and radical objectivity. I mean, all of these differentiations point to the same phenomenon. That in the juxtaposition between these two modes of thinking, the conscious rational perspective is bound to triumph over the unconscious irrational perspective. And Freud himself was originally committed to a version of this common sense view. He posited that mental disturbances or neuroses were caused by unresolved conflict between conscious and unconscious thought processes. The conflict, I want the meeting to end now, I'm supposed to open the meeting. Which he would then posit is a neurotic condition. And he said, through psychoanalytic techniques, the conflict could be brought into conscious awareness, especially through the interpretation of dreams, which he called the royal road to the unconscious. And the conflict could be resolved by the hierarchically superior force of rational secondary process thinking. So he puts the chairman of the meeting on the couch, and the chairman of the meeting pretty soon discovers that his unconscious thought was, end the meeting. And at that point he said, it was stupid of me, I made a mistake. Go back, we're going to open the meeting. Triumph of rational thought. And that was, in a nutshell, this oversimplification, Freud's view of what happens in psychoanalysis. You let free association happen, and then you learn what the unconscious thought is. This idea of the hierarchical superiority of rational thinking over the irrational is the meaning of a famous dictum that Freud said, which is where id was. And that's the id, the word id stands for Freud, for the unconscious and impulses and everything outside of rational control, all of the roiling passions in us. Freud said where id was, their ego, that is to say the rational controlling self, come into being. As Freud's thinking developed, however, he saw greater complexities in the confidently rationalist hierarchy. But Freud's psychoanalytic successors engaged in a more radical revision. Thus, notably, Hans Lowell, psychoanalyst in New Haven, of the last generation, turned Freud's dictum on its head. Lowell did not refute Freud, but he observed that it was equally true in human thought processes that where ego was, there id shall come into being. So there's a shifting relationship that modern psychoanalysts see, not a one-way street such as Freud imagined, toward rationality. Rationality then encounters a pullback to irrationality, or secondary process thinking, then engages in a pullback toward primary process. And that's how our minds work, constantly shifting between these two perspectives that are radically inconsistent. So you can see, in terms of my earlier claim, that human cognition is made up of disturbingly incommensurate elements. And this is what I meant by that we are constantly looking at the world through inconsistent premises and trying to negotiate how to resolve them, when in fact they can't be resolved. So it's if you think hard about it, it's very disturbing to think that, we're all looking at one another in this room, except each of us have images of our past history that we're sorting out as we look at one another. So I look at you and I say, or in my unconscious, you remind me of my daughter, let's say. And then all of my attitudes toward my daughter get colored before you and I have exchanged a single word. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't get to know you as an individual, but that's not where I start. And that's not where you start with me. I don't know who I remind you of, but it's somebody, and you run through those associations before you hear a word that I say. That being so, when you multiply the number of people in this room, how many here? 150, I don't know, 200? By the number of other people who are prominent in our mind, we're talking millions here. This room is teeming with people and identifications, and we're sorting our way through them. And it's not as easy as it thinks. And in fact, it's very enriching to imagine all of this, unless, of course, it disables you, because there's so much buzz going on that you can't do what your primary task is as you define it. Whether, I don't know, it's to answer your email or listen to my lecture, or whatever it is. There's a lot of interference there that has to be come forward. In terms of this, the unsettling impact of this notion of mind, Freud was quite proud that he was a force for deep, unsettling implication. He immodestly compared himself to Copernicus and Darwin. Copernicus, Freud said, showed that the earth was not at the center of the universe. Darwin showed that humans were not at the apex of life. And he, Freud, showed that mankind was not master in its own house, that we were not masters of ourselves, that our thoughts were not under our control. Freud observed that all of these discoveries assaulted mankind's self-esteem. His own work challenged the conventional idea that each of us has a stable internal image of a unified self that exerts control over our thoughts and behaviors. That's the key notion that he refuted. Our minds, he said, are inevitably divided between primary and secondary process thinking, between conscious and unconscious. Each of us can work hard to resist this proposition, and typically lawyers, in my experience, work harder than most. We can insist that as adults, rationality has uncontested rule in our minds, that we have fully embraced the secondary process premise of the self as objectively separated from the external world, including other people. But if I insist that my mind is unified, and that I am in control of that unity, I am necessarily and paradoxically fragmenting my mind by denying its inevitable division between two inconsistent modes of thinking. In this rigid stance favoring rationality, my mind is at war with itself. And now let me again pause for the Sulle. Sure.
Decisamente più comodo prima. Allora, partiamo da un punto di partenza che è sempre buono, e cioè il giurista che pensa che ci possa essere una distinzione netta tra la responsabilità di ciascuno, cioè quello che ciascuno di noi controlla e quello che ciascuno di noi non controlla, è una consapevolezza molto rassicurante. Cioè, è un modo di fare ordine nelle azioni degli uomini. Cioè, se noi sappiamo che c'è un comportamento tendenzialmente consapevole di cui siamo padroni, sapere questo è naturalmente un modo di mettere ordine nella società, perché coloro che non hanno controllo di ciò che fanno sono pazzi. E quindi è, diciamo, il crinale lungo il quale dividiamo quello che è sano e che quindi può essere imputato di una qualche responsabilità e quello che invece è pazzo e che quindi normalmente viene isolato dalla società, viene messo da una parte perché fa disordine, perché è una cosa diversa, perché è una cosa patologica. Allora, abbiamo detto prima che questa è la visione del giurista, è un modo del giurista di fare ordine tra i comportamenti umani. Per il neuroscienziato tutto questo naturalmente non ha senso, cioè il neuroscienziato come se arrivasse, soffiasse su un castello di carta e facesse cadere tutto, perché questo tipo di ordine per un neuroscienziato non ha senso, perché tutti i nostri comportamenti sono basati sui meccanismi neuronali che stanno dentro il nostro cervello e noi siamo in qualche modo frutto di ciò che meccanicisticamente avviene dentro il nostro cervello. Allora, queste sono le premesse, no, di cui avevo già parlato prima. Ora, prima abbiamo visto il percorso filosofico invece che dice che ciascuno di noi è fatto di componenti tra le quali si alterna, tra le quali si divide, che non consentono di separare con tanta nettezza ciò che è decisamente sano da ciò che invece può essere definito pazzo, deviante. Vediamo adesso qual è la prospettiva più squisitamente psicanalitica, cioè qual è il contributo di Freud nella definizione dei meccanismi attraverso cui noi siamo o non siamo padroni di noi stessi. Allora, come diceva Burt prima, Freud, naturalmente una buona parte della dottrina di Freud oggi è una dottrina, diciamo, persino offensiva se non insultante per molti di noi. Freud era misogino e quindi alle donne psicanaliticamente attribuì un motore dei comportamenti femminili, no, che deriva dall'invidia del pene. E ovviamente non è, come dire, non è una definizione delle donne molto lusinghiera, perché in ogni caso le colloca in una posizione molto, diciamo, subalterna. Per cui c'è una buona parte della dottrina di Freud che non ha più senso di essere difesa esattamente come quando è stata elaborata a cavallo dei 2 secoli, tra 800 e 900. C'è però una grande intuizione che rimane naturalmente il contributo ancora oggi insuperato della psicanalisi freudiana, cioè la divisione tra il conscio e l'inconscio. Cioè quello di cui noi siamo perfettamente consapevoli, che riusciamo a controllare e che si richiama anche ad un principio di razionalità, e quello che invece noi non controlliamo e che spesso noi neppure conosciamo e che però fa parte di noi tanto quanto la parte razionale che, no, con cui siamo immediatamente in contatto. Allora, l'intuizione di Freud soprattutto si innesta in quel momento della vita di ciascuno in cui appunto si passa dal pensiero primario al pensiero secondario. Allora, poi prima si è attardato lungamente a raccontare quello che avviene normalmente nei comportamenti di un bambino molto piccolo. Un bambino molto piccolo difficilmente fa distinzione tra quello che è vero e quello che è fantasia, tra quello che succede nella veglia e quello che invece succede nei suoi sogni, e sappiamo che i bambini anche molto piccoli ne hanno. Già il bambino, insomma, ognuno di noi nasce da un contesto in cui è difficile separare il bambino dalla madre, essendo nello stesso corpo, nello stesso organismo. Quando il bambino nasce, il bambino si rende conto che se piange per la fame, o anche non necessariamente per la fame, ciò che immediatamente gli viene fornito è il latte per nutrirlo. Quindi il bambino pensa di essere assolutamente onnipotente come creatura, perché pensa, se io ho fame e voglio qualcosa da mangiare, il semplice desiderio che sento immediatamente fa comparire il latte. Quindi il bambino pensa di essere lui in qualche modo a causare la comparsa dell'alimento che lo sfamerà. Passare da questo tipo di lettura della realtà a invece una lettura, diciamo, più adulta, che arriva con i bambini più grandi. I bambini, cioè, che cominciano a capire, dopo una serie di fallimenti, cioè dopo una serie di circostanze in cui piangono perché hanno fame e il latte non arriva. Quindi si rendono conto piano piano, e immagino sia veramente molto traumatico per ciascuno di noi, anche se non lo sappiamo, rendersi conto che da essere onnipotenti, che potevano far comparire il latte semplicemente volendolo, ad un certo punto il latte non compare più. Quindi uno dice, rimane fortemente depotenziato rispetto, diciamo, alle capacità di concretizzare i propri desideri che pensava di avere all'inizio. Allora, l'intuizione di Freud sta nel pensare che la crescita dell'essere umano non passa dallo stato primario di onnipotenza del bambino allo stato secondario più razionale, in una perfetta trasformazione in cui si abbraccia il secondo approccio e si abbandona completamente il primo. L'intuizione di Freud è che il ragionamento primario che fanno i bambini in realtà non viene mai completamente cancellato da noi. E quello che la memoria, il comportamento e l'automatismo che noi deriviamo da quando eravamo bambini si sedimenta, si posa da qualche parte, rimane in un luogo della nostra identità, del nostro sé, su cui noi non abbiamo più nessun controllo, e che è il nostro inconscio, e che ha un suo modo di manifestarsi, un suo modo di parlare, un suo modo di venire fuori, anche quando noi assolutamente non ce ne rendiamo conto. E prima faceva un esempio tipico dei racconti di Freud, cioè c'era questo amministratore delegato che doveva aprire la riunione del suo consiglio di amministrazione, ma non aveva assolutamente voglia di farlo, e quando ha dovuto aprire i lavori ha detto si dia fine a questo incontro, e poi si è immediatamente corretto in quello che noi in italiano chiameremo un lapsus freudiano. Freudiano perché? Perché Freud ci ha insegnato che quello che sembra una pura coincidenza, quello che sembra un errore assolutamente trascurabile, invece rivela qualcosa di quel mondo primario nel quale noi siamo nati e cresciuti nella prima fase della nostra esperienza di vita, e che poi è stato sopraffatto dall'approccio razionale con cui noi abbiamo il controllo su di noi e sulla nostra vita, e che però è rimasto lì. E quindi nel momento in cui l'amministratore delegato batte il martello e dice si dia fine a questo incontro, cioè si dia inizio a questo incontro, in quel momento il suo inconscio ha espresso il desiderio di non essere lì, malgrado dovesse esserci, malgrado naturalmente dovesse dar corso a quella riunione. Questa è la grande intuizione freudiana, e questo è, diciamo, la base della distinzione tra quelli che Freud chiamava l'es e l'id, es e id, cioè le due componenti, una razionale e una invece inconscia, che dividono la nostra identità. Allora, dopodiché a questo punto lascio di nuovo la parola a voi, però da queste cose che sono state dette fin qua, diciamo, forse piano piano cominciamo a vedere qual è la direzione verso cui questa lezione tende, cioè il diritto ha un modo molto rassicurante di definire l'identità di ciascuno, le sue responsabilità che derivano da un controllo razionale di sé, e ciò che non è razionale, non è controllabile, che quindi viene categorizzato come pazzia. Il diritto in questo dà molto ordine, c'è una netta separazione tra ciò che è razionale, filosofico, razionale, controllabile, e ciò che invece è pazzo e fuori controllo. Le neuroscienze, con il loro fondamento appunto neuronale, mettono in discussione questa distinzione molto netta, e a dire il vero, se si guarda al pensiero filosofico e psicanalitico, di tutto si ha riscontro della possibilità di trovare davvero un concetto che ordina, che separa nettamente chi è pazzo e quindi chi può essere allontanato dalla società e chi invece è completamente lucido, responsabile dei suoi comportamenti. Aggiungo soltanto una cosa, che nella lezione di domani quello di cui Burt parlerà è soprattutto di omosessualità. Omosessualità, cioè, per molto tempo considerata nella storia della cultura americana, ma sono certa che ci sono, diciamo, dei profili di assimilazione, di continuità anche con altre esperienze, l'omosessualità considerata come una forma di deviazione irrazionale e quindi come una forma di pazzia da escludere dal novero delle persone razionali, responsabili, che veramente fanno parte della società, diciamo, della comunità. E in un excursus, vedrete domani, molto suggestivo, poi ci racconterà come a partire dalla guerra civile americana, che sembra non avere niente a che fare con l'omosessualità e con il trattamento che l'omosessualità negli Stati Uniti ha subito nell'ultimo secolo e mezzo, in realtà a partire dalla guerra civile, proprio all'insegna di questa forma di ordine della società tra chi è sano e chi è pazzo, gli omosessuali sono stati, diciamo, annoverati tra i comportamenti irrazionali, devianti e quindi ovviamente legalmente perseguibili e giuridicamente allontanabili invece dal numero delle persone sane con il pieno controllo di sé.
So, this is complicated stuff. We've almost run out of time, but I was told we had till noon together. So let me finish by kind of pulling one strand together and telling you where we're going to go tomorrow. The picture of cognition from the unstable philosophic sense that Taylor started with, and then the deeper sense of the conflict in all of us between primary and secondary process thinking, it looks like, from a certain perspective, to be a disordered mental state. And this disorder brings us back to the insanity defense. The insanity defense, when we first talked about it, I said the thing that was characteristic was an incapacity to distinguish fantasy from reality. The schizophrenic hears voices and thinks that they're not in his own fantasy world, they are real. We objective observers look at him and say, that's not true. So you are mentally disordered. What we have to struggle with, though, is that the disorder of the schizophrenic, who doesn't fit ordinary categories of distinguishing reality from fantasy, is very close to the description that I've taken from Freud to talk about the power of fantasy and the difficulty of kind of coordinating or resolving or accommodating primary process thinking, which says that any thought that you have is real, and secondary process thinking. Put another way, there is something deeply disturbing about insane people in our universe because we are not all that different from them. And we sense it. Now, we don't articulate it, and in fact, the passion that we have to say, oh, well, here's insanity, and it has clear boundaries, and we know it when we see it, kind of like pornography, and over here is normality, and these two never conjoin. They're completely different from one another. This is in the effort, it seems to me, to say to ourselves, my primary process thinking is well under control. I am in control of it. I have these rigid compartments that separate these two modes of thinking. Now, in fact, I have argued, Freud shows us, it seems to me, if you take him seriously, and here's the wolf that underlies the lapdog discovery of the unconscious, that this is not easy for any individual to traverse. And so when we see people who are obviously conflating reality and fantasy. We are driven to say, oh, but that's not me. That's completely different from me. And the suppressed suspicion that we all have, which is, it's not so different from me. So the internal conflict in our mind turns into a kind of social imperative. How do we organize ourselves so that we're not overwhelmed in the way that we think insane people? We know, we watch, insane people are overwhelmed. We do this together. We don't do it as individuals. That's the primary premise of my next two lectures. That we coordinate our activities together, even though we don't know that we're doing it. We don't say, as a group, we are defining insanity in a way that protects us all from thinking that we're all insane. But in fact, that's what we do. That's the group activity that is the response to the problems of individual cognition. This is the way that individual cognition and collective cognition kind of reinforce one another and can't exist without the other. One of the ways that we're doing it here today, at this moment, and then I'll enlarge on this when we come back together tomorrow, is our orderly behavior. In fact, many of you may have thought, as we approach the noon hour, I'm just going to start helping people. Move it on. Let's get started. Come on. And anyhow, I'm hungry. I want some milk. And that thought may have run through some of your heads, but you know enough to know that would be disorderly. It would be disorderly. It would mark you apart from the ordinary way that we negotiate reality and fantasy. The reality here is we all sit orderly, and wait until the lecture is over, and then we go and guzzle milk or whatever we want to do. But we're reinforcing in this orderly behavior the sense that our rational minds are in control. And we're not doing it alone. It's a shared enterprise. And once one understands this to be a shared enterprise, then you see the beginnings, at least, of the relationship between legal regulation of social behavior and individual psychology. And that is ultimately my goal, to point out that these two are intertwined in some important ways. But we don't begin by assuming that everyone is rational, or at least I don't begin there. Instead, I see us all as negotiating what we call rationality together. So with that kind of groundwork in a very short period of time, really, you've been very polite and patient with this. Tomorrow I want to move into social regulation of behavior and show how this phenomenon about individual behavior and psychology in fact is interwoven in social behavior, and elaborate even more in the third lecture. But you will see tomorrow where it is that I am going. I think we have reached our time to end today. And the question of having an informal conversation, well, first of all, amongst us for your questions. We're not going to do it today, although I'm going to hang around for a while. Everybody wants to stay. But after tomorrow's lecture, there will be time for more interaction. And then we'll see when it is that Benedette is suggesting that we also have some informal time.
But even if they have questions, now we have time.
Is that right?
Yeah, we
okay.
have time.
Okay. I'm thinking in American mode. That is to say, if the hour is called to end at noon, then it's a deep offense to rationality and order, at least in the United States. But maybe you folks are more relaxed, and that's nice. So I give the podium back to you, and you decide what it is you want to do with the time.
Pensare che diamo definizioni definizioni di pazzia e allontaniamo i pazzi da noi perché sono troppo simili a noi e questo ci fa paura, naturalmente, non è troppo rassicurante. Ma naturalmente questo è uno dei modi perseguiti anche dal diritto, oltre che dall'organizzazione civile delle comunità, per allontanare da sé ciò di cui si ha paura. E spesso si ha paura di qualcosa perché si teme che quel qualcosa ci assomigli più di quanto ci possa piacere, che ci sia alieno ma meno di quanto sembri in prima battuta. Quindi domani vedremo come, con la categoria dell'omosessualità negli Stati Uniti in particolare, come questo, quanto vero questo possa essere stato. C'è qualcuno che ha qualche domanda? Qualcuno che, come quando si aprono le acque del Mar Rosso e qualcuno deve attraversare prima. Un Mosè che... Charlie? No, you may ask either in English or in Italian.
Exactly.
It's the same.
Whichever the easiest for you. Except if you ask it in Italian, then it has to be translated.
Yeah, but that's fine.
I prefer English also.
That's good.
We know there are clever instincts or inventors or genius people have different behaviors, and do you think unconscious mind is corresponding with the non-used part of the brain? Because we know we use every part of our brain, and I don't know.
Sure, no, I understand. The short answer to the question is yes, it seems to me, and there have been many commentators about what differentiates, let's say, great artists from lesser artists, and people, who just then bumble on the piano. And I am persuaded, and people of a Freudian background speak to this a lot, that greatly creative people have more access to their unconscious thinking than those of us who are more constricted. And that there is where originality comes from, there is where creativity comes from, there is where great beauty comes from, and really it's accessible to all of us. But most of us, most of the time, kind of rigidly constrain ourselves to be hyper-rational and screen out all of this incredible richness. We have, if you believe Freud's account, and I do, we have in our minds already this capacity to look at the world in dramatically unusual ways. And there are two ways to respond to that. One is to say it's too frightening, it makes me feel out of control, and I'm going to ignore it all. And the other preferable way, and that's what I'm actually going to develop this theme in the next two lectures, is to say, no, the richness is there. And it's available if you can find your way. And one way to find your way is to go into psychoanalysis with a Sigmund Freud, but it's not the only way. But the short answer to your question is yes, our minds are wonderful instruments, and we use only a portion.
Somebody else?
I would say, too, this does not surprise me that there are not a lot of questions that come up, because this is unfamiliar, I would think, to most of you. The material we'll be talking about tomorrow and the next day, about social regulation, and particularly stigmatization of vulnerable groups, and relationships of oppression and enslavement, are going to be much more familiar to you. And at that point, I think you will see how these ideas weave into one another, and there'll be more time and easier for questions, I think. But thank you for your attention.
Non avete bisogno di traduzione,
Oh, okay, so do you want to do what we plan to do?
Wow, that would be great.
The conversation.
You're not too
Oh,
tired?
no, I know.
The
question is, are other people?
Are you tired? No? Yes, please.
I would like to share
microphone, or can you just speak up? Okay. Okay.
I'm not an expert on the matter because I'm a PhD student on comparative languages. So I'm here because the title of the seminar was very interesting. I'd like to, I don't know if you know a TV American drama series, because it's Breaking Bad, probably some of you, yes. It was prohibited here in Italy because it was considered, let's say, not coherent with our mentality. Yes, and I think that in this TV series, the struggle between sanity and insanity of the protagonist is very evident. Let's just give a very brief summary of what. Yes, the TV series is about a guy living in Albuquerque. He's a chemistry professor, and he's starting to producing amphetamine, which is a very common drug in America, because he discovered he has a cancer, a lung cancer. His son has got mental problems, brain disease.
His son?
Yes, and his wife, she's about 40, is pregnant. So in the he's foreseeing his death, and to earn as much money as possible, he's starting to do this illegal activity and producing amphetamine. Yes, of course, this is an illegal activity. He's involved in crime. So the respectability of his life is parallel to this illegal activity. And all the TV series seems to be a sort of dream of his mind, and you can tell the difference between the dream, the waking, and the dreaming. Yes, it's sort of, even though of course what he does is completely real, objective. But in a way, the TV is constructed as if it could be seen as yes.
Well,
and this is and this is an example of how the theme you were talking about is permeating our society, everywhere.
Yes. Well, that's a lovely application. What I was saying, and I'm astounded to hear that this program was forbidden in Italy. So most of you have never heard of it, I guess. But my wife and I were absolutely kind of committed to it. You know, we waited for it to come out, and we bought the tapes of it and watched it. And I will say this, given a terrific summary for those who obviously haven't seen it, of what it's about. What is most striking to me in the account that you gave, and which had not occurred to me actually on just watching the film, the thing that triggers the action and the illegality is this man having cancer, which he believes is terminal. There is nothing that more effectively dissolves the self-controlling self than death. Death is the end of yourself. And it forces all of us, when we are in direct confrontation, like this fellow, it unsettles the boundaries that we have worked out before. Now, what happens to this man over time is that he earns billions of dollars in this illegal amphetamine trade, and it's very gripping, and he keeps almost getting caught and so forth. And his brother-in-law is an FBI agent, and so it's a great plot. But the thing that's striking me is that by the end of the series, he is producing much more money than he has any need for. it's as if, you know, the death, which then dissolves self, and then the new baby coming on, which is kind of great, but that's the beginning of self, just unhinges him. Now, so he doesn't look mentally ill, but there's something out of control in him. And death does this, actually. Death does this. I don't mean to make a plug for a book of mine, but I will do so. I wrote a book, published it about a decade ago, I guess, called Death is That Man Taking Names. The title is taken from a black spiritual. And death is that man taking names. He has taken my mother's name and left my heart in pain. And the book is exact, well, as you would think from my presentation today. It talks about how disturbing death is in terms of having a self. And one of the arguments that I make is that the movement in the United States for legalizing assisted suicide is all put in terms of the idea of self-control. You know, that there's a normative value to being to self-control, and the laws that forbid it are inconsistent with this notion of self that we all want to die with. And what's the notion of self according to the proponents of assisted suicide? I want to die with myself in control, confronting the one act in all of our lives that are completely beyond our self-control. So I argue over many pages, but ultimately come to the point that it's a delusion that's at work here, and that we have to then decide how as a society we want to confront this, and not simply see it as a struggle between autonomy, the self, and non-autonomy, and thinking we can vindicate the value of autonomy. So in any event, in that book I play out with exactly this theme. The theme that I've developed here isn't a book yet, but it will be someday.
Yeah, it will be next year.
Yeah. Anyhow, that's a terrific.
Ah sì, perché una cosa che io ho dimenticato di dire è che la casa editrice Luino si è interessata ad Alberico Gentili Lectures, e quindi ogni anno le lezioni che vengono tenute qui a Macerata saranno pubblicate in un libro, in una collana speciale che Luino ha creato proprio, e una collana che si chiamerà Alberico Gentili Lectures. Quindi per chi è mancato all'appuntamento dell'anno scorso con il mestiere di giudice dell'individuo calabrese, potrà aver modo di recuperare quelle lezioni, così come in italiano le lezioni di Bo verranno tradotte nel volume del Mulino che verrà pubblicato l'anno prossimo. This will be a book, yeah.
In Italian, as you said.
In Italian, yeah, exactly. Much easier for everybody. I mean, at least more or less everybody here, because we have foreign students here. Okay.
Any other thoughts?
Yes, please. Oh, let's see.
Well, I like to see people.
Oh, you like to see people? Okay.
Hello? Okay. Considering that mad people are excluded by society, more or less, okay, could we assume that madness doesn't exist, but that we can only classify it by different levels, different kinds of derangement, depending on the social context and on the majority of people that in fact constitutes society? I don't know if the question is clear, but...
No, it is. I would say that in terms of normal mental functioning versus abnormal mental functioning, it's a spectrum, and that people fall at different places on the spectrum. The idea that means that there's no such thing as madness, well, the category of madness does trouble me, but there are people who are on the far end of the spectrum, and particularly with abnormal brains, and we don't fully understand kind of the structure of brains well enough to be able to confidently distinguish. Well, here's the cutting edge, you know. On the spectrum, it's like from 0 to 90, and then 10 to 100 are the mad people. But within the psychiatric professions, there has been an enormous wish to do this kind of categorizing. And it seems to me, it's not crazy to say that mental disease is different from mental health. And if you've ever interacted with people with active schizophrenia, you know the suffering that's involved for them, and the hearing of voices that seem to be coming from nowhere. So I wouldn't want to, kind of say, kind of glibly, oh well, but they're just, part of the normal life and not treated any differently. But what happens in our social attitudes is that we've ended up, or for a very long time, been in this bind, in the insanity defense in particular, in which the insanity defense is offered as an exculpatory, as an excuse. The rule then is, well, if you're insane and you commit some criminal act, then we can't punish you because you're not in control. It doesn't fit our idea of free will. So what then do we do with that person who has stabbed somebody to death, thinking that they're the embodiment of the devil, let's say? We can say, well, they're not responsible, so instead we should be warmly welcoming to them. That's just part of the spectrum of human behavior, but that's not what we do. What we do is to say, well, all right, you're not guilty by reason of insanity, we can't punish you, so what we're going to do is put you for the rest of your life in a huge mental institution and offer you no treatment because you scare us, and get out of our face. Now, if that's not what punishment is, I don't know. But instead we say, oh no, but we're not punishing you. We're putting you in a mental institution. And everybody knows mental institutions are a great place to be. Oh, wonderful, like country clubs. Which is to say, in our response to people whom we label mad, we express this ambivalent attitude, which is, well, we want to somehow treat you differently, we want to be understanding, we want to acknowledge that you are not an animal, that you're part of the human community, and that's what not guilty of insanity means. At the same time, we remove you completely from the human community by, tossing away the key. So this contradictory attitude, the sources in which I think I tried to talk about today, which is, the mad are like us, but then they're unlike us, but they're like us, but they're unlike us. So it's a conflicting attitude, and it's a terrible thing, and it's hard to break out of it in social terms because of the resistance that you have that comes importantly, I think, from people's acknowledgement that, there but for the grace of God go I, maybe there go I. So.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor Burt. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
And thank you for your lecture, of course. How do we deal with the awareness of insanity? In other terms, provided that I'm aware of my insanity, should the law, and up to what extent the law should require me to restrict my behavior in order to protect my neighbors or other members of the legal system?
Well, first of all, one of the things that's characteristic of many mental illnesses is a lack of awareness on the part of an individual. There's something wrong with their thinking. They know that they're constantly getting into trouble with their social environment. But the idea that it's because of an abnormality in their thinking, not all people with mental disease have that. But if you assume that some do, and my own sense is that with serious disability, it fades in and out. Sometimes it's seen as abnormal and dangerous behavior by the individual themselves, and sometimes it's not. But even if they're fully aware all the time, if what they're led to do is seriously dangerous to their neighbors, we've got to do something as a society. There has to be some intervention. Now, with the advances in neurology, one of the ambitions is that we will find ways of intervening into the very structure of the brain in order to identify, where it is that this has gone wrong, and actually change the neuronal patterns. And we've been able to do this in powerful ways with mice, with fruit flies, with snails. I mean, there's a whole range of animals. But we're far away from this with human beings. This raises some questions that I'm going to address in my third lecture, in terms of invasions of autonomy. What has to happen? Do you make these kind of interventions once we have them and we're far from them, only available to a person who consents? But if the person refuses to consent, is that a measure of the fact that they don't understand that they're mentally ill and need treatment, so it makes them more dangerous? So you put your finger on a real problem in terms of dealing with people who not only don't think in concert with the rest of us, but actually endanger the rest of us in some important way. And then there's the struggle not to overstate the danger. We're right in the middle now in the United States, just recently with the Newtown killings, with someone who obviously is not working right. And now the killings in Boston, how do we think about that? Do we say, oh, well, that's a person who is a purposeful terrorist? Or do we say there's some disease that's going on? So this is incredibly complicated. But maybe it'll clear up once we perfect these neuroscientific modes of intervention. Or maybe we're stuck with it. My inclination is to say we've been struggling with this problem for hundreds of years and will continue to struggle. And the idea we're going to solve it is something to be more worried about than happy about. But that, because solving the problem, again, here comes the neuroscientists, many of whom are my best friends, who say, finally we have the tools of rational control of ourselves. We can intervene in ways that we couldn't. At last, the self-controlling self. And as soon as I hear that kind of premise being put forward, I worry, because I don't believe it, and I don't believe that we believe it. Even those of us who say, I'm in complete control of myself. First person who says that, protect your wallet and your life.
Well, you should be feeling flattered, because this is absolutely unusual for an Italian audience, made of Italian students. They are so eager to put questions.
Well, that's lovely. I tell you, it wouldn't happen in the United States.
So you're better than Yale students.
I could be delivering the Ten Commandments for the first time in the history of humanity. Come noontime, 3/4 of the people would leave. By the time I'm around the commandment number 7, they shall not steal. Now we're not interested in the rest. So yes, I am flattered, and I'm very impressed at your willingness to stay.
I find very interesting the theory of Taylor about the role of God and the refuse of God. Actually, I was saying that God in the late 17th century was refused because it was considered irrational. So how rationality, which is a product of mind, can be more concrete or more reassuring than God? So that's quite a tricky question, but I don't know if it's quite clear. But I was wondering that even rationality can be more reassuring. So how to define ourselves and impose rationality, feeling that is much more reassuring than God.
Yes. Well, Taylor's book is really quite profound, and it's quite long, and he goes into this at great length. I quoted a little snippet from it. But the existence of God, using his idea, solves a lot of problems for us. And once it came to be seen as irrational, and Voltaire was who famously said, if we didn't have God, we'd have to invent him. And that was the kind of insight that Taylor himself built on. The existence of God solves conceptual problems for us that can't be solved in any other way. But I believe that it's not only non-believers, it's the whole culture that has removed God from his explanatory force and reassuring force. And it's very hard, I think, for us to recapture as a culture how comforting the belief in God was. And that's part of the stubbornness that, historically people have exerted. But then it leads people to see those who deny the existence of God not just as discomforting, but as dangerous. And dangerous to their beliefs. Again, one can say, you believe what you want, I'll believe what I want. But if, to jump ahead in a way that I'm going to develop, if you deeply believe that there's no difference between you and me, if you're thinking with primary process thinking most in your mind, the fact that you tell me there's no God is a direct threat to me. And so, we can't just say, oh, well, you're free to believe what you want, and I'm free to believe what I want. It gets to be a much more complicated statement. So you burn people at the stake, and it seems crazy from a modern point of view. Free speech doesn't hurt anybody, let them espouse what they want. But that means you don't take the belief in God very seriously, actually. If you don't see it as a deep threat to yourself. It's why, by the way, I called my lecture, but the reason that I called my lecture the insanity offense, not the insanity defense. The insanity defense is the way it's customarily thought of. But the point I was trying to get on is that insanity is an offense against all of us. It's offensive behavior, and it's not all parceled up by itself. Like the refusal to believe in God. And again, I'm a little stunned by the news that this TV program that I found very enjoyable was actually banned in Italy, but it means that people take ideas more seriously, I think, than we in the United States. Oh, it's just a cute little pleasure. It's not a pleasure. It's dark. It's deep. But then if you confront its darkness, its wolf-like quality, then I guess it makes perfect sense to say you've got to slay it, you've got to contain it. So it's just, I would not have imagined if somebody said to me, well, like the place like Italy, where they have banned watching this TV show. It was like banning the Mickey Mouse Club. I mean, why bother? But they take it seriously. And we've lost something in a way. We don't take ideas as seriously as that. But we lose a lot more if you burn people at the stake for their ideas. So.
Anybody else?
I think that's fine.
Huh?
I think that's fine.
Oh, that's fine. I believe that's fine. We have two options now here. Either we have our conversation right now, or we can set an appointment for tomorrow afternoon at 3, starting with the conversation. What would you do?
I would leave it up to you. Now, tomorrow afternoon at 3, but we're meeting for the second lecture.
Yeah, at 3.
Oh, at 3.
Yeah, so we could start the gathering with the conversation and then with the lecture. Just half an hour or so with the conversation and then the lecture. How are you? Siete stanchi?
Should we do a vote?
Okay.
I think people are tired.
Yeah, okay. Allora,
if you have taken seriously what I've tried to say, you should be very tired.
So I would say this way. For those of you who will be pleased, of course, to come also tomorrow, and we'll start our meeting with this conversation interview.
People understand what the conversation is about.
I think so, but I'm going to explain that. We'll have a conversation dealing with both life and professional career. just to give you a hint of what we are going to talk about, Bo was admitted at Princeton, right? Admitted at Princeton.
I was a student at Princeton for undergraduate.
Yeah, exactly, for
Yes.
undergraduate.
Yes.
Okay, and at that time, only 10% of the students could be Jewish, right? So there was a limitation for Jewish students to be admitted even in the most prestigious universities. So at that time, the Jewish community was in a certain sense discriminated.
Oh, not in a certain sense.
Not in a certain sense, in the proper sense, right?
In the very meaning of the word.
Okay. So he was part of a discriminated minority when he was at Princeton. This is just to give you a hint of the experience of being different somehow that our keynote speakers could have experienced in their life. But this feeling of non-belonging somehow may be turned into something as a propellant for the career or for the... Is that right?
Sure. It's something to be talked about.
Okay.
But in terms of, we've already had a bit of this conversation, and if you find it interesting, I certainly find it interesting myself, of the status of Jews in the United States, of what being Jewish has meant to me, what it meant to my father, to my grandfather. So that's a part of what makes me who I am. And then the other thing we talked about, that we'll talk about in our conversation, is how Sigmund Freud and I came to know one another.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're interested, see you tomorrow. Okay? Have a nice day.